Welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. I'm here with Dr. Kevin Dutton. He is the author of The Wisdom of Psychopaths. His book was recommended to me by a regular listener, Tim, if you're listening. So thank you for that recommendation. Delighted to have you with us, Kevin. Hello.
Hi, Richard. How are you?
Good. I'm doing really well. And we've got the video turned off because you're ensconced in your Cotswold bolt hole, as I understand, in the countryside in England.
I do. Well, actually, I'm probably doing a huge service to your listeners by having that video turned off, Richard. But I live, apologies for that, folks. I live in a remote Cotswold valley. And unless, I don't know how long this podcast is going to be, but unless you want it to last for 6 hours with loads of cutting in and out, it's probably better to have the video off, I think. So save everyone a bit of time.
Yeah. Well, let's start with what is a psychopath, Kevin?
Well, it's a good question, Richard, and it's a very important one to start off with because, of course, as soon as most people hear the word psychopath, they instantly think of Hannibal Lecter in fiction and Ted Bundy in real life, these kinds of serial killers and rapists and what have you. But actually, when psychologists like myself talk about psychopaths, we're in fact referring to a distinct subset of individuals with a specific constellation, as it were, of personality characteristics, such as you've got your ruthlessness, you've got fearlessness, you've got mental toughness, you've got confidence, you've got coolness under pressure, you've got emotional detachment, and then, of course, you've got your trademark deficits in conscience and empathy that you hear so much about. Now, I think one of the things that's really important to remember right off the bat, Richard, is that none of those characteristics that I've just mentioned about psychopaths, none of those personality traits is necessarily a problem in itself. But rather, the problem lies if you, I suppose, deploy them in the wrong contexts and with the wrong intentions. So I'm sure we'll come on to that a bit later on when we talk about professions and where psychopaths can thrive. But actually, the short answer is that, when you talk about a psychopath, technically, you are talking about someone with a distinct subset of personality characteristics, such as I say, ruthlessness, fearlessness, and lack of conscience and empathy, those kinds of things. Right. And what drew you particularly to this topic? Like, why devote your life to this area? Well, I have to say, if I'm being totally honest, my father was, looking back on it, a psychopath. He had, I came from a working class family. He had all kinds of different jobs. He was, he worked in a bookmaker's. He was a market trader, not on the stock market, but on the streets. He was like Del Boy, even looked like Del Boy. He could sell all kinds of things to all kinds of people. Most of them were rubbish and didn't work. But he was ruthless. He was fearless. He was charming. I never once saw him embarrassed, and he was shameless, and he could do things that most normal people would find completely psychologically impossible. I mean, I'll give you an example. I always remember one evening when I was a little boy, him taking me out to an Indian restaurant for dinner in the East End of London. And just as he's about to pay the bill, I always remember him turning around to me and saying, "Kev, if there's one thing I want you to remember in life, son, it's this. Persuasion ain't about getting people to do what they don't want to do. It's about giving them a reason to do what they do want to do. So watch and learn." I always remember he took his spoon and he tinkled it against his glass, and the entire restaurant fell silent. Then Dad got to his feet and he starts to make a speech, an impromptu speech. And he says, "I'd just like to thank everyone for coming. Now, I know that some of you have come from just around the corner and some of you have come from a little bit further afield, but I want you to know that you're all very welcome and that it's very much appreciated. And there's a pub across the road called the King's Arms, in which we'll be hosting a little drinks reception after this. It would be great to see you all there," right? At which point he starts to clap. At which point, picture the scene, right? The entire restaurant starts to clap, right? So all of a sudden, we've got a restaurant full of people, never seen us before, never seen each other before, all applauding wildly because none of them want to be seen as the gate crashers to the party, right? Well, anyway, as we're leaving, remember, I'm only about 9 or 10. I can't resist it. So I turn around and say, Dad, I mean, we're not really going to the pub, are we? And I'll never forget it, Richard. He puts his arm around me and he says, course not, son. But let me tell you something. That lot in the restaurant are, my mate Malcolm, he's just taken over as landlord. He'll make a few quid tonight. Now, can you imagine, mate, how much money I would have to pay you or any of your, most of your listeners, because some of them might be psychopaths. Can you imagine how much money I'll have to pay you to even attempt, to even think of pulling a stunt like that? But that was the kind of thing that my old man would do without batting an eye, without thinking about it. He was just totally in the moment, never mind about the consequences. Let's just do it. Whatever. And he, if that was him to a T. And I think looking back on it, he wasn't an educated man, but he was certainly one of the most persuasive men I've ever met in my life, certainly psychologically insightful in that way. And I think watching my dad among people and the way he dealt with people, I think it not only kind of got me interested in psychopaths much later on in life, it was probably the instigator to me studying psychology itself in the first place, really.
Right. Yeah. What an extraordinary story. I actually imagine Del Boy doing that. And for those who don't get the reference, he's a well-loved character on British television, a market trader.
Well, he even looked like Del Boy. My dad even looked like Del Boy. He really was. He was a rough diamond, but he was a cheeky chappy and he could get away with it. But as I say, he certainly exhibited. He wasn't a violent man, Richard. He wasn't a violent man. But then again, if you think about the characteristics that I've just outlined, you don't necessarily need to be violent to be a psychopath. That's one of these myths. If you are a naturally aggressive person and you are a violent person, and you also have those psychopathic characteristics, then you may well turn into a violent criminal. Or you'll be more likely to use violence in order to get what you want. But if you're if you have those psychopathic characteristics of ruthlessness and fearlessness and charisma and low conscience and empathy, and you're not necessarily violent, then you might go into, you might end up becoming a con artist or something like that, and not using violence. So, he was, looking back on it, as I say, he wasn't a violent man, but he was ruthless and he was fearless and he was shameless. And as I say, had all the hallmarks of someone who I would say, as I write in the book, would be high on the psychopathic spectrum. So that's the other thing which I always kind of try to make clear, being a psychopath is not an all or nothing, black or white thing. You're either a psychopath or you're not. Yeah, okay, at the extreme ends of the spectrum, you're going to have people who are pure psychopaths, and you can certainly sense that they are once you've had a bit of experience around these people. But, we're all on a spectrum. That's the key. There's just like the autistic spectrum, spectrum of autistic behaviors. One of the things I talk about in the book is this idea of there being a psychopathic spectrum. And we're all on it to some extent.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm just interested as well. So were there any adverse impacts on you as a child? Was there any kind of a dark side to his psychopathy that you experienced? Or?
Do you know what, actually, Richard, if I'm being totally honest, I've got, my dad passed away 20 years ago now, or so I believe. Anyway, but looking back on it, I have nothing but fond memories of my dad, actually. He was, as I say, a very charismatic person, a very charming person. He was a very warm person. Now, whether he was or not, I don't really know. He was certainly very good at faking it.
Right.
But I can honestly say no, there were no real... I can't really think of any negative impacts on my life. I think when I look back at things, I think mainly of the positives, really. And my dad was very much the kind of guy that would say, if you really want something, go for it. Don't think about the negatives, think about the positives. And of course, psychopaths are very reward driven. That's one of the things that sets them apart from many other people. They, one of the reasons why they're very good under conditions of where of grave danger, for instance, where the rest of us might be really concerned about what's happening. Psychopaths seem to have this absolute nonchalance where they can act very calmly and very coolly because they're very in certain situations, they're very driven and drawn by what they can gain from the situation rather than what they can lose. So I think that, one of the things that my dad, probably the biggest thing I draw from him is that ability to, to see the positives in situations. I mean, I wasn't as averse to coming unstuck as he was, but I certainly inherit a little bit of the of that kind of desire for risk and going for it that he had.
Right. And I'm interested, have you done one of the tests? Have you discovered how much of a psychopath you are?
Yeah, I think we're a bit pushed for time. You got the next question there, Richard. No, I mean, actually, I think
you've got his charm, Kevin. You've got his charm and his humour.
I've been trying to get away with it for a few years now. But actually, I mean, it's funny. I am quite high on the psychopathic spectrum, and I'm not afraid to admit that, Richard. But let me put it in context. So imagine that you've got your psychopathic characteristics such as ruthlessness, fearlessness, etc., etc. And if you imagine those kinds of characteristics as being almost like the psychological events in a decathlon, right? You know what a decathlon is, right? An athletic event with kind of 10 kind of different events. You've got your javelin, 100 meters, 400 meters, all those kind of things. So if you imagine that psychopathy consists of like 10 personality characteristics, sub-axes of personality. So these are your 10 events in your psychopath decathlon, as it were. Your pure psychopaths are going to be really, really great performers, high scorers in all of those. And for me, I suppose one of the things which prevents me from, not being flippant about it, just trying to make it easy to understand, one of the things that prevents me from being a world-class Olympian psychopath is the fact that, when it comes to something like conscience,
more county level.
Yeah, county. That's exactly right. I'm a good club psychopath. I'm a good county psychopath. You're right. My conscience event is pretty weak. So, I have a pretty strong conscience. So I wouldn't deliberately go out to shaft anyone or do anyone down or anything like that. So that, I suppose, again, not to be flippant, kind of lets me down, as it were, in the psychopath stakes. So I'm high. I've got some good events. But I've got some pretty weak events too. So I might be, as you say, I'm a good county level psychopath. That's a good way of putting it.
Right. So I'm interested. Well, on the ones that you're high on, how do you use those to your advantage?
Well, I think, as I say, in terms of fearlessness, I've never really been that worried about too many things. So, as I say, I don't worry about too many things, and I'm very good at decoupling, what I call decoupling emotion from behavior. I think that's a very interesting thing that actually is a very healthy question that many of us could ask ourselves. And that is, since when do you need to feel like doing something in order to do it? Well, the answer is pretty much never, because, if we felt, none of us really feel like getting out of bed in the morning, and yet we do it. If we didn't get out of bed in the morning, we wouldn't do anything, right? So decoupling emotion from behavior is something that I've always been pretty good at. And I'll give you a great example of this. There was a study conducted a few years ago by somebody where they looked at, when you go on holiday, right? You go on, well, can we ever remember when we went on holiday, right? But you go on holiday and you're in your swimming trunks or your bathing costume, whatever, and you've got the sea and the swimming pool right in front of you. There's two kinds of people in the world, Richard. There's people that just jump straight in or run straight in and get all the cold, all that pain over and done with in one bash. They're we call the jumpers or the runners. And then you've got what we call the splashers, right? You know what I'm going to say. People that kind of tiptoe into the sea, take 30 minutes to get in, or like tiptoe down the stairs of the swimming pool, and you're gradually getting up to your knees, and it's terrible, and then finally you get in. Well, there was a study. You'll be pleased to know there was a study done a few years ago by someone, I can't remember who it was now, who wanted to find out, a research team, who experienced the most pain. Was it the jumpers? Or was it the splashers? Was it the tiptoers? And actually, they discovered, probably unsurprisingly, that it was the people that inched their way in experienced more aggregate pain. Because, of course, not only were they aggregating it out over a long period, there was also the imaginary pain that they thought they were going to experience. And we imagine pain often to be far greater than it was. So they didn't just eke it out for longer. They also had that problem of the imagination. It's going to be far worse than it actually was. So what's that got to do with everyday life? Well, actually, what it's got to do with everyday life is we psychologically splash every time we've got to do something that we don't want to do. If you've got to, I don't know, pick the phone up and give someone bad news, or do a chore that you don't want to do, something you've been putting off for a long time, what do? We put the kettle on, we do our email, we make a cup of tea, we tidy up, we do anything but get on with what we're meant to be doing. We psychologically splash. Whereas actually what we really should be doing is harnessing our inner psychopath, decoupling emotion from behavior and saying, hey, let's just do it. Let's just bomb straight into this pool, run straight into this sea, and get this over and done with in one fell swoop. So that's something I've always been pretty good at there. There's just one example. And it's one of those psychopathic characteristics that I think if as I say, if your listeners are struggling with procrastination, are struggling with that kind of all putting things off, they're psychological splashers by nature. Just by being aware of that little analogy, as I say, that's a great kind of way in which you can harness a psychopathic characteristic to your advantage. You perhaps make you a little bit more efficient, a little bit more assertive, a little bit more confident, whatever.
Yeah, and I totally relate that with sales calls. And I noticed that salespeople are quite high on the psychopathy. I'm a massive splasher when it comes to sales calls, and I'll procrastinate for hours until I get on the phone and call to people in my network. And that makes complete sense. And actually, there's a guy who's been on the show who's a sort of sales coach, and he makes this play for just do it. Just like set yourself like 3 calls. Just do it now. And jump and dive into it and don't think about it and just call the first 3 people on your phone, whatever it needs to be, just dive in. And I'm guessing that people who are salespeople who tend to be high on the psychopathy scale find that easier. Hence, they gravitate towards that profession.
Well, you know what? Psychopathic profession is very interesting. But I always remember when we were a student, we used to play address book Russian roulette. And I'm not suggesting anybody does this, but I can say that sometimes a few drinks were taken before we used to play this game. And it was basically you just, somebody finds you hand somebody your mobile phone and they pick 2 people at random from your address book that you have to ring up there and then. And of course, the Russian roulette element comes in where it could be somebody you haven't spoken to for 3 years for very good reasons, but you just have to do it. If ever you want to get over, making that sales pitch, that's a great game to play, but it is a dangerous one.
I love it. You also talk about it in terms of boys and girls and, making approaches in girls. And, there's a game you mentioned where the idea was you just had to, in fact, it was your friend. Was it your friend? I can't remember exactly the context for it now. But the game was to try and get as many no's as possible in the night from knockbacks from girls. And, the lesson is that after X number of knockbacks, you start actually getting more acceptances because you've become so cocky in the process that you actually become attractive.
That's exactly right. I think it was, if memory serves me right, I think it was somebody I interviewed in a high security unit, actually, that came up with that. And yes, they're absolutely right.
That's right, yeah.
They would go out in a group on a Friday or a Friday night, where, as a group of 4 lads. And the aim of the game was to get as many rejections from girls as they possibly could. And there was a great incentive to do this because the next night, the Saturday night, whatever night it was, they would the person that got the most rejections would have the beers, all their drinks paid for them by the other 3. But there was a great method in this madness, and that was that, of course, once you actually start realizing that getting rejected doesn't really matter, and actually, you just move on to someone else or whatever, and it's not the end of the world if people don't like you or don't want to go out with you or don't want to give you their number, then all of a sudden what starts happening is you naturally start getting more confident. It doesn't matter to you anymore getting rejected. And of course, once you start getting more confident, you become more appealing. And then you don't start getting rejections anymore. And as I say, when that starts to happen, the dynamic completely reverses, and you're no longer losing the game; you're winning the game. and you're a completely changed character. So yeah, I mean, actually, there was a lot of method in that madness, and it's all to do with confidence. But you were talking about, professions, and sales are. I conducted an experiment. I'm not sure if you know, but maybe your listeners might not know it, but conducted a survey a few years ago, about 10 years ago now, I think it was, in which I wanted to know which was the UK's most psychopathic profession. So I was on a radio show, and we put out a call, and we had a website. And what happened was people were directed onto the website, where they completed a specially designed questionnaire, psychometric questionnaire, designed to measure psychopathic characteristics within the general population. There's separate questionnaires for the general population and for the criminal forensic population, which is very important to bear in mind. You shouldn't confuse them. So people were directed onto the website, where they completed the psychometric measure for psychopathy in the general population, and they then gave their occupation. And as I say, they got their scores, and then I was able to look at the analysis afterwards, and we compared occupations with score. It's a very rough and ready kind of survey, but actually it was very, very interesting what came out. And number one, perhaps not surprisingly, was CEOs. Number two, off the top of my head, I'm going off the top of my head now, Richard. Number two, I think, was lawyers. Then we had the media, TV and radio. And then I think salespeople came in at number four, and surgeons were up there, I think, number five. But what was really interesting, I think number 8 or 9 was church people. And at the time, as I say, this is about 10 years ago, at the time, this was...
cleric, number 8. I've got the page here. That's right.
Yeah, was it? Yeah, clerics. And I think it was 8 or 9. And
8 for cleric.
Was it 8? There you go. Good memory I've got there. It was really, it's very interesting, because at the time you thought, well, what's that all about? But, there's been, as I said, since then, there's been a few stories about the church in the media. And I'm not casting any aspersions. There's bad eggs in any profession. But, actually, if you think about the church and religion, it's in one aspect, it's no different to any other business. It's all about, if you've got to have a certain kind of personality to get to the top. There's a hierarchy in the church. Just like any other business. And it's also, you could argue, very much to do with the implementation of power. You've got a lot of power over people in the church. And I'll always remember a few years ago when I was in Cambridge, talking to quite a high-powered church person, and them turning around. It's one of the most chilling remarks anyone had ever made in their life to me. And they turned around and they said, "Kev, I don't believe in God. I'm just good at him." And I remember thinking, blimey, I can believe that in your case. I don't believe in God. I'm just good at him. And that was, I've met a lot of psychopaths in a lot of different circumstances, but even now, that was probably one of the most chilling things anyone had actually said to me.
Right, kind of God by numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. And, yeah.
The expression popped out in the book that you use. Psychopaths are able to do emotions by numbers, and they're actually better. This is what I found fascinating. Am I right that they're better at recognizing emotions in general than? Do you know what, Richard?
I thought that was a good line. Do emotions by numbers, and I thought, of course, I'd totally forgotten I'd written it. But I thought. Yeah, modesty is another psychopathic trait, of course. But absolutely, there are a number of experiments which appear to reveal that psychopaths are better at kind of gauging emotion than the rest of us, or at least as good, which is very interesting, because there's also evidence which suggests quite strongly that psychopaths don't feel emotion like the rest of us. They don't have what's called hot empathy. Hot empathy is the feeling of feeling what another person is feeling. It's really empathizing with them, whereas actually they seem to be much better than the rest of us at what we call cold empathy, which is kind of cognitively and dispassionately imagining what another person might be feeling. And of course, that enables them to be very, very good persuaders. We talked about that with my dad. That's one of the reasons perhaps why he was such a brilliant persuader. He was also very charismatic. but why psychopaths may be a very good persuaders, very manipulative. And I remember talking to one guy who was a psychopath, a pure psychopath in a high security unit. And again, another quite chilling comment that he made to me. He said, you know, Kev, he said, you don't need to have color vision to understand how a traffic signal works, how traffic lights work. You just have to know which bulb is lit up. And that was one of the truest things, I think, one of the truest insights that any psychopath had ever had into their, I suppose, own condition, because, you know, traditionally psychopaths don't have that much insight. And maybe it wasn't an insight. Maybe he was just telling me a fact, you know, that's the truth. But actually, that's a very, very good way of looking at how psychopaths go through life. They don't see the color of emotions, but they do see which bits light up. And as I say, that makes them very dangerous individuals in the wrong circumstances, because they can engage in persuasion, they can engage in debate without feeling the heat and the light and the cut and thrust of battle. They're almost like psychological surgeons. They can stand back, as I say, cognitively and dispassionately pushing the buttons and pulling the levers, which gives them a real advantage, this ability to remain very cool under the pressure of cut and thrust debate and persuasion.
Right, yes. And it reminds me of, because I watched the Ted Bundy documentary on Netflix.
Right, I haven't seen it actually, but he was obviously...
just extraordinary. And I still, even by the end of it, found it almost impossible to reconcile this character before me. He seems so warm and charming and lovable and gentle, and the facts of his crimes, just extraordinary.
Well, it is. I mean, one of the things that psychopaths play on, of course, is you know, we have a natural kind of tendency to, you know, believe what we see and to be taken in by what's in front of us. And, you know, if you've got someone who's acting normal, your brain automatically, you know, our brains didn't evolve to analyze every single scenario that we encounter from first principles. We go by rules of thumb. And if you see someone that's very pleasant, I mean, you know, psychopaths are very rare, Richard. You know, you're talking pure psychopaths, you're talking, you know, 0.5 to 1% of the population. So you don't go through life, you know, actually, even if you don't, most of us don't think bad of people all the time. If you meet someone, you know, who's normal, you give them the benefit of the doubt usually. But if you meet someone that's very charming and very nice, you know, it's in your interest to say, well, hey, this is a nice guy, I can get on with him. And that's something which psychopaths use to their advantage. You know, they're very good at putting on that persona. This kind of psychological camouflage, you know, hiding in plain sight is the phrase that's often used. They're almost like psychological double agents. And they're able to lure us into their trust. And then, of course, you know, you get stung later. They exploit you later. But, you know, you'd have to be a very, very dumb psychopath to, you know, portray yourself as like a ruthless criminal. And think you're going to get away with it, you know, and you know, you're not going to do that. You have to go in under a cloak of disguise, don't you?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then what's also interesting, and you cite, I think, one of your fellow researchers who was retelling the story of being in a prison and shitting himself basically when this particular psychopath switched from that persona into this cold-eyed stare when he'd asked him the wrong kind of question and pushed his buttons. And
no,
also
that
came
was
through
me.
in the Ted.
Yeah,
it was you, was it?
That was me. Yeah, no, that was me. That was it was. Yes, I remember it was in the very early stages when I'd first started studying psychopaths, and I went into this high security unit, and there was a not very nice guy on the ward. It was a hospital, and he looked very avuncular. I seem to remember he looked like Captain Birdseye. He had a big grey beard. He was quite jolly. He had, like, you know, elasticated trousers on and a kind of a woolly jumper. And I was on the ward and he said, "Oh, I'll show you round," and he did. And he showed me his room, and we had a little walk about, and then it was very funny because the clinical lead on the ward had gone off to perform an errand of some sort. So I was just walking around. I didn't feel in any danger at all. There were, you know, there's people there, you know. And he made a joke. He said, I'll show you around. I promise I won't kill you. And I kind of, chuckled and laughed and, blah, blah, blah. And off we went. And 20 minutes later, he'd shown me, various places on the ward and all that. And then we came back and it was time for me to go elsewhere. And he said, there you go, son. I promised I wouldn't kill you. And I didn't. And I kind of laughed. I went, yeah. And instantly, flick of a switch kind of thing, his eyes just changed and his whole demeanor changed and became glacially cold. And he fixed me with these really, really cold eyes. And he said, you don't get it, do you, son? I told you I wouldn't kill you, and I didn't. And I learned a very big lesson that day, Richard, and that was that, you know what? These people, and it goes back to your earlier point, they may look very much like the rest of us. They may sound very much like the rest of us, but actually they have a completely different moral compass to the rest of us. And actually, when he said, I promise I won't kill you, and I didn't, I took that as a joke. But actually, there was a real sense in which he meant that literally. And when I laughed it off, it was me disrespecting him. It was me dissing him. And then he suddenly turned. I never made that mistake again. It was, you had to be there. It's kind of, it's powerful in the telling, but you had to be there to really get the sense of how chilling that actually really was.
Yeah. And it reminds me very much of the same story on this Ted Bundy documentary where it was a prison guard describing being in a lift with Ted Bundy, and Ted Bundy suddenly had that same switch and he was suddenly in the lift with Ted Bundy with this cold-eyed stare. Yeah, exactly the same.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Experience, right? Yeah. And I just wondered, just to bring that, so obviously this is in the context of killers, and that's obviously how we often associate psychopaths. But in the general sort of workplace, you say 1% and a higher preponderance of those, presumably higher than 1% amongst CEOs and senior executives and so on, which obviously many people listening to this will encounter on a daily basis. So what's there to kind of understand about people who are high on this scale, on this spectrum, in terms of interacting with them, interfacing with them? What can people take away from your experiences from that perspective?
Well, I think there's a number of different points there to unpack, Richard. I think first of all, you can have. I've done a lot of work with a guy who some of your listeners might know called Andy McNab. Andy McNab is an ex-SAS soldier, an entrepreneur, and a best-selling author these days. We've written a couple of books together on psychopaths. And Andy McNab is a psychopath. I've diagnosed him and I've checked him out, and he fits all the criteria, and he freely admits that. And it's really interesting. Andy and I have, on the back of my first book, The Wisdom of Psychopath, first book on psychopaths anyway, we came up with this phrase called good psychopaths. And I'll give you a good example. So, those traits, if you imagine psychopathic characteristics as, like I say, ruthlessness, fearlessness, self-confidence, coolness under pressure, emotional attachment, all those kinds of things as the dials on a psychological mixing desk that you can twiddle up and down in various combinations, you arrive at two conclusions, okay? Now, the first conclusion is that there is no one-size-fits-all objectively correct setting at which these dials may be positioned, but it will invariably depend on context, upon the particular set of circumstances that you might find yourself in, okay? Now, the second point, which is directly related to your question here, is that there are also going to be certain professions which by their very nature are going to demand that some of these mixing desk dials be turned up just that little bit higher than average, demand what we might call, as I call it in the book, some precision engineered psychopathy, okay? Now, we've already talked about some of those, top psychopathic professions in the Great British Psychopath Survey that I conducted a few years ago. But, imagine you've got imagine you've got the skill set to be a top surgeon, right? Which I think was number 5 in the list. But that you lack the ability to emotionally disengage from the person that you're operating on, right? You're not going to cut it, are you? Quite literally, in fact. And I've interviewed a lot of surgeons that totally get that. Imagine you've got the skill set to be a top I don't know, lawyer, QC, barrister, but you lack that almost pathological self-confidence to be the center of attention in the middle of a packed courtroom. Again, it's not going to work, is it? Imagine you've got the, let's come on to CEO straight away. Imagine you've got the strategic and financial smarts to be a top business person, but that you lack the ruthlessness to fire someone if they're underperforming, or the coolness under pressure to ride out a storm, or the sheer balls necessary to take a calculated risk when appropriate. Okay, it's not going to work, is it? Now, those characteristics that I've just outlined for you there, ruthlessness, fearlessness, self-confidence, coolness under pressure, and emotional detachment, comprise 5 core characteristics of the psychopathic personality. Okay, so in those particular contexts, would you say they were dysfunctional? I wouldn't. So certain professions, of which CEO is one or business is one, are going to demand certain psychopathic characteristics. Now, it's really interesting. In order to succeed in any given profession, Richard, you need 2 things. Firstly, you need the requisite skill set necessary to do the job. But secondly, you need the right kind of personality, right, to enable you to optimally operationalize that skill set. Now, as I say, in those situations, certain psychopathic characteristics are definitely going to predispose you to success. It's going to become no surprise to you or your listeners that, in certain situations, it's possible to bully or blag or bullshit or, your way up the corporate ladder. That's going to be no surprise to anybody. We've all experienced people that do that. But I think what is most interesting is that if you do have the requisite skill set to do what you should do your job, certain psychopathic characteristics can actually help you get up the ladder. But you've got, going back to the mixing desk style, you've got to use them in the right context, in the right combinations, at the right levels, and with the right intentions. So that's very much where I'm coming from. So a lot of the media at times have said Dutton, and when I've been working with Andy McNabb, Dutton and McNabb are trying to turn the nation into psychopaths, and what could possibly be good about psychopaths, And actually, that's never been my intention. What I've always said is that there are certain psychopathic characteristics which, used in the right context, in the right combinations, at the right levels, and with the right intentions, can predispose you to success. And that's basically the argument that I'm using. So, you CEOs are an interesting group because, actually whether you've got a bad, people think about, psychopathic CEOs, and there's been, or people in business, your Gordon Geckos or, your Jordan Belforts and all these kinds of people who are corporate psychopaths. They've allowed their mixing desk styles to be turned up too high, and in the wrong levels, in the right context, and for the wrong intentions. But actually, it's when you get the dials just right in the right context, actually, that's when you get a good CEO. Another example would be sports. So I do a lot of work with elite sports people. And sports are a very interesting genre to look at because give you an example, say somebody like Roger Federer, the tennis player. Now, Roger Federer off court is one of the nicest people you could ever wish to meet. But on centre court at Wimbledon or in Flushing Meadow or somewhere like that in New York, if he's in a Grand Slam final, he is absolutely ruthless and predatory. And would have absolutely no problem at all. He's done it 20 times. He's won 20 Grand Slam finals. Absolutely no problem at all about humiliating his opponent in front of millions of viewers and a watching crowd. Now, any top sports people that I've met absolutely have that killer instinct. They have no shred of compassion or remorse about humiliating opponent on a court where they're on or where they're playing. But, just imagine that, were Roger Federer to behave like that, in everyday life, not on centre court or Wimbledon, he'd soon find himself in a very different kind of court. But it's really interesting, isn't it? Because all of a sudden, when you talk to people like that, they have no problem accepting that in sport. It seems to be, okay, par for the course. But if you switch that kind of behavior to the business arena, all of a sudden people have well, not all people, but some people have a real problem with that. More people, put it this way, more people have a problem with that in business than they do in sport. And usually what you hear is, sports, it's not really real life, is it? Well, of course it's real life. Actually, you're humiliating someone in front of a global audience. It couldn't be more real than that. You are really meting out a lot of pain and punishment on somebody. So what's the difference? And I think that's an interesting question to mull over.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Well, the first thing, thoughts come to mind. One is, I guess it's certainly in the case of that tennis situation, one might argue, well, it's just one psychopath against another psychopath.
Yeah.
A CEO bullying and firing and harassing everyone in his orbit or her orbit. That's a different situation. Those people have not necessarily signed up for that kind of treatment.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, so within the context of a social institution, I guess the impact of psychopathy being expressed, does have different ramifications. Maybe that's part of the mix here.
Yeah.
But the other thought that came to mind was that I remember an interview with Steve Wozniak, of course, Steve Jobs' sidekick. You've referenced Steve Jobs in the book. But him saying, and I think the interview was, calling out some of Steve Jobs' negative traits. And Steve Wozniak says something to the effect of, but don't be too hard on Steve Jobs. I couldn't have done what he did. I thought that was quite an insightful thing to say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Steve Jobs, he had some very interesting little quirks, and I think, again, came up with some very, very useful tips and techniques that we can all learn from. And I think one of the things I remember from Steve Jobs is that he would have, he once said that in order to succeed in life, you need to say no way more times than you say yes. And, of course, when we say no to people, we disappoint them. And it's often, quite a few of us have problems saying no. And I seem to remember someone saying once that, actually, Steve Jobs, almost had a ledger of, and he would check the number of times that his employees would say no compared to the amount of times that they would say yes. He would have them keeping a kind of a register of it. Now, whether that's apocryphal or not, I don't know. I mean, I can believe it. In his quest to leave no stone unturned. But absolutely, again, it's another one of these simple little things that, maybe in order to be a little bit more successful, something that Andy McNabb and I talk about in our book, Good Psychopath's Guide to Success, you need to get used to saying no a little bit more. We need to be, sometimes we need to be a little bit less nice. Actually, it's really interesting. A lot of the time, you could turn this on your head, actually, when you say no to people. A lot of the time, people, when you drill down into it, people are frightened of saying no because actually they don't want to disappoint someone. You don't want to make them feel bad. But actually, that's in itself a form of inverted narcissism, because actually you are immediately assuming there that you are really important. That actually, if you say no to this person, they are going to be totally crestfallen. And actually, sometimes you can have a little laugh with people and you can say, do you really think that highly of yourself then? Do you really think it's going to matter that much if you say no? Well, I'll tell you what, why don't you give it a try and do it and see what happens? Yeah. So it's a good way of fun way of kind of inverting it, really, Richard.
Yeah, but I mean, I suppose practically it can people, if you like, switch from like hot empathy to cold empathy in that way, because to say no, you have to somehow detach yourself from the potential feelings that you're projecting onto that other person, that they might feel upset or angry or whatever that might elicit as an emotion. Is it in fact practical for people to make that switch?
Well, I mean, if you can't, turn overnight like that, you can't absolutely, turn yourself into a different person. But actually, if you just start very slowly. There are certain situations in which you say, okay, I've got something coming up now. I'm just going to try it. I'm just going to say no to this. So, I'm not, it's very, very difficult, impossible probably, just to change overnight like that. But you can build it up over a period of time, just like, training for the marathon or something, just start slowly and gradually build it up. Start with some easy no's and then gradually build up to some harder ones.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it actually relates to some, perhaps we'll get on this as we sort of close out the hour here, but a guest on the podcast who, is a religious man, talks about making more space in your life, slowing down, focus on fewer things. And of course, the key to that is saying no. And he has this idea of no by default. And the way to do it, maybe, and he suggests this, is not immediately coming out and saying no. It's like, well, can you give me 24 hours, or can I get back to you on that, as like a means of delaying that a softer way in, perhaps, that doesn't require such a psychopathic approach, perhaps, is
not quite jumping into the pool, but not tiptoeing either, but maybe just going waist deep a little bit, something like that, to use our early analogy. I'd give a couple of, another suggestion there. And that is, a couple of good yardsticks is whenever you are asked to do something, right? Imagine that you are asked will you do X and Y? If you have a rating scale of 0 to 10 and you say to people, rate how much you enjoy doing this. Okay. So a lot of people, 7 on a scale of 0 to 10 is quite a common number. And a lot of people will agree to do something if it approaches 7. And then the problem with that is it's kind of okay, but you don't really want to do it, but you end up doing it anyway. It's in this kind of no man's land. So a very simple, and I'm sure all your listeners, we've all done it. We've all hovered around the 7 out of 10 and agreed to do something, right? So a very simple thing to do is when someone asks you to do something, if you don't want to say no straight away and you want to take this approach, let's think about it. Draw a little rating scale out in front of you and write down the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but then miss 7 out and go straight to 8, 9, and 10. And then say, right, you're going to rate how much you want to do this on this scale of 0 to 10, but you don't have 7 on there. You don't have that as an option. So you've got to either rate it as a 6 or you've got to rate it as an 8. That really forces your hand. If you rate it as a 6 because you're forced into doing that because there's no 7, don't do it. If you rate it as an 8, then okay, probably chances are it's something you might want to do and agree to do it anyway. So that's a good yardstick to use, a little trick. Which can sometimes make your diary a little bit more palatable. And another trick, which again, Andy McNabb and I talk about in our book, is like, next time someone asks you must be inundated, as a lot of your listeners will be, Richard, can you do X, Y, and Z in a couple of months' time? So you look at your diary, there's nothing in it. The day's free. So you agree, because you want to be nice. You say, okay, I'll do it. And then what happens? That day rolls around quicker than anything. And it's the last thing you want to do, right?
Why the F have I got to do this?
Exactly. It's the last thing you want to do. So here's the interesting tactic to use. Okay, next time somebody asks you to do something, imagine they're asking you to do it tomorrow. Forget 2 months' time. Right. Are they asking? Imagine, look at your diary, right, I'm doing it tomorrow. There might be something in the diary. Is what I'm doing in the diary, would I cancel that in order to do this? Are they paying me enough in order to cancel that to do this? Do I really want to do this tomorrow? Would I give up what I'm doing tomorrow if I've got a day off, for instance? Would I actually be happy to do this on my day off? If the answer is no to any of that, you say no to the request, because in 2 months' time, it will be tomorrow and you will be faced with exactly that dilemma. So just bring it forward and have it as tomorrow and ask yourself the same question. There's nothing like bringing it forward to add clarity to your decision.
Yeah, I like that. And I suppose that's the way of bringing it into the realm of the sort of hot empathy, because you're making it more immediate. And if we are an empath, we can then start to feel how that would be in our diary, in our life, and make a decision based on that.
Absolutely. It's just using the power of imagination. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No. That makes sense. And it's. I know we've not got long here, but it was Garland Vance was the guest who, he's written a book called Getting Unbusy, and he has this, thing of, no by default. But the tips you've added there, might be useful for him to sort of or consider for that approach. But again, interestingly, this parallel, and you get to it in the last chapter of the book, between the sort of spiritual path and psychopathy and the parallels between spirituality and psychopathy. And I guess it's interesting to see that there are these overlaps. And I guess is this a means of thinking about psychopathy in a slightly different way? That, you know, it's almost like it's a way of directly uncoupling it from this idea that it's all sinners, and actually there are all of these traits in some ways can aid us even in a sort of quest for spiritual development.
Well, I think that's probably putting it that argument's a bit strong, Richard. I think one of the interesting things, although I thank you very much for making it, but I think what is an interesting thing is I was drawn to the parallels, the similarities between mindfulness. Which, when I was writing Good Psychopath, when I was writing The Wisdom of Psychopaths, mindfulness was relatively in its infancy in those days. Back in 2012, it's now become obviously a huge phenomenon, global phenomenon, and was obviously derived from Buddhist practices, and it's all about living in the moment, mindfulness. And when I first came across mindfulness, it struck me that actually this is seen as an enhanced and elevated spiritual trait, but actually this is also one of the primary criteria for psychopathy, the idea of, you know, no sense of consequence, living in the moment, being a spur of the moment kind of person. In fact, I'll tell you what we might do if you want to. We can end with a little test to see if you're a psychopath. I can read out 11 items that you and your listeners can have a go at. We'll see where you are on the psychopathic spectrum. Yeah, we can do that if you like. But just to come back to the mindfulness thing. So yeah, I mean, one of the questions, the reason I thought of that was one of the questions is, you know, are you a spur of the moment kind of person? So when I first encountered mindfulness, I thought, well, actually, this is very, very interesting, because this kind of uber spiritual quality of living in the moment is also, as I say, one of the character traits of psychopathy. And so I was very interested in that overlap. You know, this idea of living in a spur of the moment kind of living, you know, which is regarded as a symptom, as you like, of psychopathy, you know, is in another camp, on the other hand, regarded as a very enlightened spiritual kind of practice. And so I looked at this a little bit more, and I asked one of the pioneers of mindfulness research, a chap called Mark Williams, who's a very good friend of mine in Oxford, and I said to him, you know, what do you think the difference is between, you know, the kind of the spiritual practice of mindfulness and you know, almost like the psychopathic approach to it? And I thought he gave a brilliant kind of response. There is a difference. And he says, whereas like the spiritual will savor the moment, psychopaths will devour it. And I thought that's a very, very good way. Although the two might appear similar, and indeed there are degrees of similarity between the mindfulness living in the moment and the psychopathic living in the moment, the spiritual aspect is savoring that moment, whereas the psychopathic characteristic is devouring it. So I think that's there's similarities, but there are differences as well. But I'll tell you what we'll do, if you like, if we can find out if you are a psychopath, or where rather we won't do that because we'll be sued. We'll find out where you are on the psychopathic spectrum, where your listeners are on the psychopathic spectrum. Would you like to do that? Would you like to?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, please.
So what you need to do, Rich, and what the listeners need to do is you need to get a piece of paper or a pen or a mobile phone screen, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out 11 statements, okay? 11 statements. Yep. And your job is to score each of these statements according to how true a description you think each one is of you, okay? Okay. Now, here's the scoring key you need to remember or write down. If you strongly agree with the statement, if you strongly agree, give yourself 3 points for that, okay? If you agree, give yourself 2 points. If you disagree, give yourself 1 point. And if you strongly disagree, give yourself 0 points. Okay?
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And I'm going to read out these 11 statements and you are going to score them according to how accurate a description you think each one is of you. Yeah. Start number 1. There's 11 of these. Number 1. Goes back to what we were talking about. I rarely plan ahead. I'm a spur of the moment kind of person. I rarely plan ahead. I'm a spur of the moment kind of person. Strongly agree 3, agree 2, disagree 1, strongly disagree 0. Okay.
Right. Do you want me to tell you as I go along or just make a note?
When you see the next one, you might just want to make a note. Okay. Number 2, cheating on your partner is okay as long as you don't get caught. I did you a favour there, Richard. I did you a favour there. I could have put you
she
right
never listens to these anyway.
I could have put you right on the spot there, mate. But number 2, cheating on your... Whenever you do this in universities, this is one where you always see people looking over their shoulder, see what they're putting on you. Cheating on your partner is okay, as long as you don't get caught. Number 3, if something better comes along, it's okay to cancel a long-standing appointment. Yeah. Number 4, seeing an animal injured or in pain doesn't bother me in the slightest. Yeah. Number 5, driving fast cars, riding roller coasters and skydiving appeal to me. Yeah. Number 6, it doesn't matter to me if I have to step on other people to get what I want. Number 7, I'm very persuasive. I have a talent for getting others to do what I want. There you go. That's certainly my dad had that, going right back to the beginning. He had that, certainly. Number 8, I'd be good in a dangerous job because I can make my mind up quickly. Don't think too much about that one.
Yeah.
Number 9, I find it easy to keep it together under pressure. I find it easy to keep it together when others are cracking under pressure. I'll read that out again. Sorry about that. I find it easy to keep it together when others are cracking under pressure. Number 9.
Yeah.
Number 10, if you're able to con someone, hey, that's their problem. They deserve it. And number 11, most of the time when things go wrong, it's somebody else's fault, not mine. That's called blame externalization. Donald Trump, of course, was very high on that one. Right. So what you should have there, Richard, is you should have 11 numbers on the page or a screen in front of you. And what I want you to do is I want you to tot those numbers up. Don't say the total yet. Just add them up. Have you got your total?
Yes.
Okay. Now what I'm going to do then, I'm going to read you out the scoring bands. Okay. Now, I will say, Richard, folks at home, because you're doing this and listening to it, we are not diagnosing you as a psychopath. This is just a general indication of where you might be on the psychopathic spectrum. Okay.
Yeah.
So 0 to 11. If you have a score of 0 to 11, you are low on the psychopathic spectrum. If you scored 12 to 17, you are below average.
Yeah.
If you scored 18 to 22, you are average. If you score 23 to 28, you are high.
Yeah.
And if you scored 29 to 33 being the maximum score, of course, you are very high. Okay. So, Richard, moment of truth for you, my son. What did you get?
Below average.
Below average. You were 12 to 17 in that band.
Yeah, I was 14.
14. Do you know what as well? I can tell from the tone of your voice, you've never been so happy to do badly on a test, have you? There you go.
That's right.
Yeah. I can just tell. Definitely room to turn those dials up a bit there, mate.
Yeah, that is so true. There's definitely, and I think it's this. In fact, I was in a coaching conversation just a few days ago with relation to this podcast, in fact. And this person, told me that one of the things she thought I could do better on was being dispassionate. That's something that I would benefit from, being more dispassionate, which is interesting.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. You've given you a few tips along the way. So, I think,
this has been brilliant. Who would have thought discussing psychopathy could be such fun? But you have charmed the pants off me, Kevin.
Well, can you put them back on, please? Because I'd feel far more comfortable if you did that. Good job. Good job. The cameras are off. That's all I can say. I always joke, Rich. I always joke, often, you with a topic like psychopaths, you've got to, as I said, you've got to work really hard to screw it up, and I'm just not prepared to work that hard. It's just, it's one of those topics that people are perennially interested in, and I've often wondered why. Actually, it's an interesting one. It's that's a whole different podcast altogether. What the allure of psychopaths is, and maybe we can talk about that at some other stage. There's more than one podcast in this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and in fact, I had a whole bunch of themes on my mind map here. We didn't get, the evolution and how they come to exist in the gene pool. What's the future for Are we becoming more psychopathic as a society? There's so many avenues we could take it down, but hopefully
podcast Psychopath 2. There you go.
Yeah, I'd love to do that, Kevin.
Back by popular demand. Yep.
Yeah, and again, the book for people, The Wisdom of Psychopaths: Lessons in Life from Saints, Spies, and Serial Killers, available in all good bookstores by Dr. Kevin Dutton. We'll put a link in the show notes.
That's great. And if you
anywhere else you want to send people.
Website, if you want to know more about kind of the work I do on psychopathy and latest stuff, www.drkevindutton.com. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm on @TheRealDr, Dr. Kev. There you go.
Excellent. Well, if I can call you Kev, thank you, Kev.
You can.
Been a delight.
Richard, really enjoyed that, mate. Really did. And it was a lot of fun, mate. All joking aside, it really was a lot of fun and entertaining, hopefully, but hopefully also enlightening as well.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it will be. Thanks again. And thank you so much for your time. And enjoy the rest of your day in the beautiful Cotswolds.
I will do. Cheers, Richard.
Thanks. Cheers.